Excellent. Well, you know something, Josh? You know something that is not the same as
Grifters.
James Slade? Grifters, yes. And it is grifters, not the grifters.
Yep.
And we're going to be doing crappin' you negative. The N, stylized N, right? With the apostrophe
Yep.
over the N, no G right there. And the U tightly tucked behind it, too. So it's almost like you're saying crappin' you negative along the way. In the montage, you've already heard Skin Man Palace. And now you're going to hear Bronze.
Because of a sunburn and shade my cellophane case. Take my matchstick. Yeah, I know some things.
Now, normally I'd say, Matt, what's the numbers? But we've got no Matt this week. But
I do have numbers.
But you
John.
do have the numbers. I
Yes.
love it, Josh. Way to
Yeah.
prepare.
So Crappin' You Negative by Grifters is number 2 in best ever albums rankings for Grifters. It is 5,299 ranking in the 90s, and it is 524 in 1994. I think those are the numbers Matt
Okay.
usually gives.
Well, the Grifters were formed in 1989 in Memphis, Tennessee. Group members are Dave Schaus, Scott Taylor, Stanley Gallimore, and Trip Lampkins. Along the way, genre, all the things I looked up, that they had a hard time defining the Grifters because they're shapeshifters. Believe it or not, they're actually on AllMusic labeled as a pop rock band.
Okay.
They're alternative rock in other areas I've seen. They are lo-fi as well in a lot of areas I've seen. But they also have been in indie rock and many others along the way. But those are the genres. So they are shapeshifters. There are bands that we covered that I think both Josh and I probably will pull right here that are there. I do laugh, though, as I'm listening. They also are one of these bands that when people are talking about them, the references they make of them are stuff that's coming on the podcast, but that we haven't covered yet. And like a good example of that is with proto-lo-fi musings of Royal Trucks and Half Japanese, of course, 2 bands I've never listened to who we'll be covering later.
Okay.
The Grifters are the Stones to Guided by Voices Beatles of mid-90s lo-fi. Now, once again, we haven't done Guided by Voices yet. We've got B-thousands coming pretty soon. So it's funny because I realized in doing that how I didn't have a lot of touch points for what they were. There's certainly things I could say it's similar to this and similar to that, but I don't feel as confident with it because I do feel this, especially production-wise, is a different lane that we're in. But let me finish.
I completely understand what you're trying to say. I kind of feel
Yeah.
the same way. Yep.
Well, I'm kind of going into my review right here before I go into the bio. So let me do sort of a quick little bio right here. They have, I think it's funny, they have released albums on 5 different record labels, and they released 5 studio albums from 1992 to 1997. Since 1997, they have had side projects. They sporadically tour. They've released material on Bandcamp along the way to do different stuff like that. That is, once again, that Guided by Voices bio is going to be fascinating. I don't know much about them at all. I know of their reputation more than I know their music, but I know they're another one that just music just keeps coming out and coming out and coming out along the way. So what ends up happening is the band is initially formed in the mid-'80s. It's called A Band Called Bud. And at that point, Scott Taylor, who's the vocalist and guitarist, bassist Trip Lampkins, because if you're going to have a guy named Trip Lampkins in your band, he's going to be the bassist, right? And vocalist drummer Dave Schaus is in there. And you may recognize 3 of those names are in the group there. Stanley Gallimore eventually comes on the drums shortly afterwards. And there's 3 songwriters in this band, much like the Beatles. So Schaus, Taylor, and Lampkins all write songs. They are named after a Jim Thompson novel called Grifters. Are you familiar with Jim Thompson?
No, the name does not ring a bell.
I did a little research on him. I'll write. I always love when something makes me laugh when it's the first thing in Wikipedia's description of it. He is a prose writer and screenwriter known for his hard-boiled crime fiction, Josh, in case you're wondering. That's his lane along the way, which makes sense because grifters, right, is something that's there. There also is a novel by them, South of Heaven, and you could probably put two and two together there, Josh, about who else might have been reading his work as well, because that is famously a Slayer album as well.
Okay.
So I did not, though, recognize too much. I don't know if he's the lane of literature as much as I read that I may be searching out, but obviously had an effect on the band together.
He wrote The Killer Inside Me. I've seen that movie.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a kind of all of these things that titles are The Getaway too, and The Grifters, the movie. So yeah, I recognize.
So
the
you know him
movies
very
that
well then.
adapted from his books. Yeah,
I feel like hard-boiled crime fiction would lend itself to the silver screen.
yes, absolutely. It's
The
a
Getaway?
staple.
Who's the attractive woman who's in The Getaway? I remember it being like a guy and an attractive woman, right, in like a car.
Yes, that you're thinking of Ally McGraw and Steve McQueen.
Yes,
Getaway.
there you go.
Sam Peckinpah is the director.
And then they remade it, right, in the
Correct.
90s, I think.
With
again.
Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger.
There you
Yep.
go. I remember both of them, so perfect. Okay, the band, in this case Grifters, releases their first album in 1992 on the Sonic Noise label called So Happy Together. After this, they made an album called One Sock Missing, because remember, they're doing an album a year. This one is on Shangri-La Records. I love these record labels they're signing on right here. They sort of callbacks to different things. Very different, One Sock Missing than So Happy Together in terms of what they were going for, which is a theme for them. And this is their third one, Crappin' You Negative. It's from 1994. It is considered to be their most well-regarded album. The thing that stands out about this album, and Josh, I'm pretty sure you're going to recognize this, the production on this is a big deal because it is half lo-fi and half very commercial production, which does create an interesting mix for me. Were you able, like, I picked up on this immediately, and I'm not some big production guy, right? But it was, even in the first listen, it was the first thing that stood out to me. Was it something that you were able to identify listening, or not so much?
Yeah, is the cutoff like at like Black Fuel Incinerator after that song? Like, does Skin Man Palace start is it a clear split between the two, or does it sprinkle them in?
So I did not see anything that said it was as clean as a clear, like a true split like that. I didn't see that. I definitely did notice, though, that the first half had more of one production style and the second had the other. This apparently becomes a hallmark for them in their remaining albums, by the way. This mix of lo-fi production and like clean production.
In some ways, I felt it almost like ramped. It started out really lo-fi and like ramped up to more and more production as it went along.
That is how I felt as well. And I wonder if that was by design. I didn't see anything that completely co-signed that idea, but it is, especially the second and third time I listened to this album, because I listened to it 3 times this week, it became more and more evident. I was able to like delineate it clearly what I was talking about, and we'll talk a little bit about lo-fi here, I think, in a second. But I will finish it by saying that Jeff Buckley, who we covered recently, was a very big supporter of the Grifters, and he was friends with the band. And yeah, the band puts 2 more albums out. They break up. They do a bunch of side projects along the way. They had a couple different tours. They had a couple albums that became inactive, and then they came back on a reunion tour in 2013, a reunion tour in 2014, and as of 2021, the band is still touring and has, as it puts here, shown interest in recording new material. So perhaps we will get another one. There are some EPs as well along the way that are there. So they put out a ton of different singles and compilations. So in that sense, they kind of appear here, there, and everywhere in their music. They're just rolling it out in different formats. So yeah, I'll add in a few more unique things about the Grifters as we go. But of all the albums we're covering this week, and I'm looking forward to talking about all of them, I rarely get an album, Josh, where I have no idea what you or Matt will think about it. And I'm very curious to hear your initial thoughts on this one.
Well, I had a feeling listening to this, not knowing the Grifters, that you would like this album. So, and I also really like this album, or I do really like this album. I don't know how you feel yet, but this album gets better the more you listen to it, And this is another like kind of hidden gem, I think, of the 90s albums. I think the last album I kind of felt this way about was Cop Shoot Cop. That was a more recent 90s album that kind of came
Good
out
call.
of nowhere and surprised me. The lo-fi aspect of it is somewhat of a barrier. When I first started listening to it, it kind of kept me on my toes in terms of, what is this band about? What are they trying to do? Like, is this going to be like too inaccessible for me? Things like that kind of ran through my head. But as I listened to it, I kind of got on its wavelength and started to appreciate the aspects and kind of the different sounds that I was hearing, and kind of references to other bands came into my head throughout. Ultimately, it's kind of like, with the definition of lo-fi, or kind of that label, there's always kind of a garage rock label that goes along with that in my mind. So, and that's ultimately kind of where this band falls in my head. But they're kind of out of tune at times on their instruments, especially in kind of the beginning part of the album. There's definitely some fuzz and distortion, but they don't really like play on that in the way that some other bands, like noise rock bands. I wouldn't classify this band as a noise rock band. I think there's an undercurrent of the blues on this, with this band, especially on something like Skin Man Palace, which I'm glad you picked that song. That was one of my favorites on here. There's also aspects of emo. I think I really got some like emo kind of tone or delivery in the lyrics on something like Dead Already or Felt Tipped Over. Maybe in the guitar sound too. That's where I'm picking that up on. And then you also get something like Jack White's guitar sound, White on the White Stripes and some of his solo stuff, like Get Out of That Spaceship. That song really kind of got the Jack White vibe. Get Out of That Spaceship and
Fight Like a Man.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't see the rest of the title. But then they also kind of sprinkle in a little Led Zeppelin, like on Junkie Blood, the second to last track, that the guitar and him singing sound kind of like Led Zeppelin. And so all of these things, I kept hearing all of these things, and it kept keeping my attention, and I really just got on the wavelength. They're also a little experimental. They're not afraid to throw in like a didgeridoo on Piddlebach, and they have a drum machine, I think, or like kind of a repeating loop on Arizona. And they do all these things, and then they just end with this fantastic song, Cinnamon, that could be like a Nirvana song almost in my mind. But they do really well, and it's really kind of the height of that, out of that lo-fi into like more traditional production, I think, that we mentioned, and just a great way to end the album. And the other kind of note that I made was, this reminded me in some way of the Captain Beefheart Safe as Milk album from way back in the 60s.
Okay.
With, not in terms of kind of like the desert psychedelia that it had, but just in terms of really taking me coming from out of nowhere and just vibing with kind of what the band was trying to do. And so this is a thumbs up for me, a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, I like this one quite a bit too, Josh. Your instincts were right about whether I'd like this. While I'm going to pull some things that it reminds me of at times, the first thing I want to say is this album's not exactly like anything we've covered.
Yeah.
It's not as easy to draw a direct branch onto it. And one of the main reasons is because we've heard lo-fi production, either because the bands didn't have the ability to pay for the equipment, you know what I mean? Like, or conscious choices that also were because they were broke, right? Like the Stooges. Punk obviously had a lo-fi by design. We've started to hear a little bit of like stylized lo-fi, like that Liz Phair album was. And then there's some of the early lo-fi we didn't really do, but I'm familiar with the names of things like Beat Happening and stuff. We didn't really do that. I'm trying to remember that one album we did in a bonus. gosh, it sounded like it was recorded on a tape recorder. I'll get to it.
I know what you're talking about. Let
Yep.
me see if I can find it.
I'll get to it later, but that's the jarring thing initially. So the first time I listened to this, it was hard for me to take it all in. It was not unappealing to me, the mix, but unlike you who was hearing it as like two distinct parts, Josh, like I heard it within songs. It was like the production would veer from, I would never say it was clean, but like a more crystallized version of it to this really soft or discordant sort of soft, loud type thing. It just sounded like they were on cheap equipment, but it was also obvious it was by design. It was a conscious choice they were making. There was like an audio decision. A couple groups that you didn't mention that I'm surprised you didn't, because there's obvious hallmarks. Pavement is one that comes to mind immediately. There's a fair amount in terms of what Pavement was doing that's here, all the way down to like some of the distortion and the fuzz. These guys, though, lean much more into like that slacker sort of sludgy sound at different times, and that's where it reminds me a little bit of band I wrote down. Reminds me a little bit of Queens of the Stone Age at times. There were like hints of that sound for me a little bit along the way. I got like a real sort of slacker sludge. It never gets as intense as something like the Melvins sludgy or like even like Neil Young necessarily sludgy, but that guitar sound is around here, as is sort of the up and down, the note choices that are not on the regular register, which is the thing that we talked about on the Pavement album along the way. That's something that they're making a choice of here. There's some humor to the lyrics here. I wouldn't say it's like winking at you humor or dark humor, but it definitely is humor that's a different, off the beaten path type of humor, sort of like an outsider humor along the way. And really, the as you said, Jess, the more I listened to this album, I like the idea you said you got on the wavelength. I was kind of on the wavelength in the sense that I get on the wavelength if something interests me, but the production just so overwhelmed my first listen, not in a bad way, but because it was so clear. It wasn't until the second listen that I was able to dial in on the individual parts, and it really wasn't until the third time that I kind of get into the lyrics and the thinking about the album in entirety. But I quickly abandoned like, what does this remind me of? And I kind of went more into, I like this style of album that if you're going to go long play, I'm liking some of these bands. We mentioned the Minutemen that were before is a good example of this album. We've had a couple different ones where they've just rolled out a variety of songs and approaches to songs on the same album. And it really, as these albums are getting longer at 55 minutes, I'm really looking at it as a feature for someone giving me more. Even bands that I like sometimes, if what they're giving me is the same thing over and over again, that 55-minute runtime, 50-minute runtime can really feel long. I'm trying to remember, what was the... I'm blanking on names this week. I should have done my homework. What was the group we covered that had like 60, 70 albums, Josh, and everyone was very different? Two different times. Yeah, the Mekons. There you go. Yes, Mekons Rock. That's another. Yeah. They didn't sound exactly like it, but they were kind of doing the same thing as this. The Cop Shoot Cop thing also was a good reference. This is not nearly as abrasive, I think, as that, like confrontational in your face, but there also are times where the musical choices challenge you a little bit, and they don't hit your ears as naturally as other sounds do. So
they have a structure that's kind of muddy at first, and you have to like dig a little when you're listening to find kind of the kind of thing you're used to underneath, which I found
and it's not, you're not going to get all the things you're used to either. And that's where it has some similarities to sort of some of the feedback groups that have a little art rock in them as well. This isn't exactly like, and that's the stuff that I know you and Matt don't necessarily like as much and stuff, that experimental Sonic Youth, a lot of those groups we covered in the late 70s and 80s, the Public Image Limiteds and stuff like that. But I like this a little bit better than that because I like that. I like it divorced from like an electronic sterile feel. I like there to be human emotion, I think, a little bit more in it, and this has a lot more in it, like a visceral nature to it. So yeah, Josh, your instincts were right. This is this is a thumbs up for me. I enjoyed this one.
Yeah. Was that first band that you were thinking of was Television Personalities? And don't the
Yes,
kids
Television
just love it?
Personalities,
Yeah,
and the kids
I
just
found
love it. Yes, which might have been the single worst recording in terms of traditional recording that we've listened to
Yeah,
of any
production,
group
yeah.
so far. The production was amazingly terrible, but also for those that are digging what they're going for, it's exactly what you're looking for too. They're giving you nothing production wise to draw you in. It's all the aesthetic in a different way. So, but yes, thank you, Josh, for bringing that up. For longtime listeners, I apologize for blanking right there. Josh is bailing me
Way
out
back
this
in
week.
1981, so in our season 3.
Yeah, but
so.
we did it like mid 80s because it got thrown in, right?
That's right.
Like when we
I
did
think
it.
Sam was on that episode.
He was, and I remember him like, "What the fuck is this?" And you and I, and that was a good example, Josh, of like we probably would have felt that same way. Like, not to tangent too much, but I recently went back and listened to "Chelsea Girl" by Nico, and I remember at the time we were like, "Oh boy, this album's really hard." You know what I mean? I don't know how I feel about it. And I listened to it this week. I'm like, "This is a much more accessible album now that I've had 40 years." I don't know what I was talking about. I like this album. If I went back and did like a revised 3 to 5 reviews I did, that would be close to the top because it went from I really don't like this to I really like this in the course of understanding music better in 30 years.
Yeah.
I did feel like that Television Personalities was when someone jumps into has a good understanding of music, but not all the things, it probably just hits you much more aggressively than even at that point where we were listening to it. And, we'd been through so many experimental bands and stuff. I think
Right.
our first instinct is not to run away from that. I would even say that we're a little bit more like moth to flame now and like, what is this like,
Yeah.
So,
Just goes to show you, if you listen to an album once, then listen to it 5 years later, you might have a different perspective.
well, and also listen to like 750 albums over 4 years and you'll get a much greater appreciation for all pop music.
Yeah.
So get started right now, and in 4 years we'll have a conversation because that's where we're at in June 2020. But would you agree that this would not have been something that would have been as easy to approach if we hadn't done 4 years?
I agree. I definitely think the road has been paved to appreciate this type of album more than previously.
Love it. So 2 thumbs up
Yep.
for the Grift.